I'm Francis Campoy, and this is Just for Funk. Welcome to episode number 11 and code review number 3 of Just for Funk. Today, we're going to review an IRC bot. What is IRC? IRC is a protocol, stands for Internet Relay Chat. And if you don't know what it is, do not worry. It is basically like Slack, just older. And maybe better, depends how you ask. I've never used it before, so don't worry if you've never used it, that's totally fine. And the bot, what it does is actually many things. It's a karma bot, and if you know what it is, that's cool. If not, don't worry, because we will not be reviewing that code. We will be reviewing a package inside of that repo that defines an API to interact with IRC. So to connect to a channel, receive messages, etc. Now, that API is quite simple. The package itself is only 4 files, but there's room for improvement. And I'm not saying that the code is bad. Thanks for sending the code, David J. Peacock. I really appreciate it. But what I'm saying is that it is actually kind of hard to misuse. So we're gonna try to make it a nice API. And what is a nice API? Well, that's a great question. I'd say that a nice API is one that is intuitive, except that intuitive is totally personal. So I'm gonna say familiar. So if you know what IRC is, it should be familiar to you. It is easy to use. It is hard to misuse. That is the most important one in my opinion. And also, it is as small as possible. We don't want to have extra methods if we don't need them. Sounds fun? Let's get started. Okay, so let's get started by first reviewing the code. So if we go to the source of the repo, we're gonna find the main.go file, and it does a bunch of different things. It defines a bunch of global variables, which I think I'm not a big fan. There's better ways of doing. Also defines a huge amount of flags. There's better ways of doing this. Maybe I'll do an episode on this, but it's not important right now. And after doing a lot of different things, the interesting part is here, when it creates actually an IRC connection. So it creates an IRC connection. This is the package that we're defining from, that we're importing from. And it's irc.new. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So irc.new, and that will create a new bot connecting to a server port with a nickname and a username. And then we call connect. That could fail, and if it fails, we exit. What else do we do? So there's con is the connection. So we listen for Control C coming, and if it comes, whenever it comes, we call con.quit, and that says Bazinga. So now we know that shellbot is Sheldon Cooper, obviously. And then we do some more things. Then we do OS exit. That is whenever the Control C arrives. In the meanwhile, we join the channel and we send a message, private message to the channel. I'm not sure if that's a private message if it goes to the channel, but whatever. It is sent saying the name of the bot and the version, and then we call con.listen, and then we range over all the private messages that we receive, and for every message we do something. It's not that interesting. Actually, we check if it starts with our own name. So if it starts with shellbot, we react to it. Also, if it's something plus plus or something minus minus, we also react to it. But that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is, let me see, so connect, quit, join, private message, listen, private messages, and private message to send stuff. Those are the things that we're gonna be using. So let's go see the package IRC. So IRC has an IRC file, which is good. That normally the main file of a package has the same name for the file as it does for the directory, which is the same as for the package. So everything is IRC here, that's good. And it defines that type connection, also a global variable debug. We'll talk about that later. And that connection has a bunch of private fields, non-exported fields. So has messages and private messages is exported. That's the one we use to receive the messages. We have new that simply creates a struct, and it creates the struct assigning values for every channel because those are non-exported, right? So, well, at least one of them is non-exported. So we need to initialize it. There's no way the user of the IRC package will. Then we have send, which is right here in the middle, but it sends something through the channel, through the connection actually, and then sleeps for some time, 1 second, 1000 milliseconds. Connects to the packet, to the TCP server. So that's the connection itself to IRC or whatever server you're connecting. And it could fail. It debugs, it prints a debug line if something fails. Then it sends this command. And this is interesting because that's how IRC works. It is based on text. So basically like HTTP, 1, not 2. And basically you send your user, the nick, then we send, that is actually wrong, I'd say. That is not the user, that is the, is it real name? Because otherwise we're using twice the same. I think I'm gonna say it's real name. Okay, and then we say nick is nickname. We send those two, and apparently that's the way to connect. I'm not completely sure that's the case, but that's not the point. The point is that we're gonna make this code much simpler. And then we have join to join a channel, join exclusive that has a 0, why not? Then we have part, which sends a part command. And then this private message to send a message to a target, and then quit to exit. And then we have listen, and listen is the one that will actually listen from the connection that we open with the server, trying to parse messages from it, right? And once it parses a message, actually once it parses a line, it parses a message from that line, right? It sends it either, so if it's the message is a command ping, we actually reply with pong. That's part of the protocol. They are the internet relay chat protocol. And otherwise, we send it either through the private message channel, or we send it through the messages channel. And then we keep on reading. Also, at the same time, we try to read from c.close. And if we receive anything from c.close, it means that quit was called, quit close there, so we exit. Cool. What else do we have in this package? We have message and the way to parse messages. We have private message and the way to create a private message from a message. And then channel with type channel and type member. Okay, so we've seen pretty much all of the code. Now it's time to start editing. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is start with this channel.go file. And defines two types, channel and member. And after looking around for a little bit, turns out that, so let's try compiling before modifying anything. So it turns out that if I remove them, nothing bad happens. It still compiles. So these were not used at all. So my first change is going to be to simply delete that file. Goodbye file, because we don't need it. So why would we keep it? So the next thing that comes to my mind is that there's a lot of variables, a lot of fields in this connection type. And we have server, nick, real name, and server is actually initialized with the server and the port here. And I think that those are not really necessary because it turns out that port, so server, port, nick, and real name are only used once in connect. So why wouldn't we pass those directly to connect? That way we don't need to keep them in the struct. Let's try that. So I'm going to remove these three. And I'm going to say that these three go away. And instead, all of these are passed to connect. Also, you don't need to write the types all the time. So we're gonna go there. Okay, so these we're going to connect to SDC server, server and port. Then, one more parenthesis. Why is this not happy yet? Because I don't know how to type. Printf. There you go. Okay. Then we're going to print that. Why not? Connect to IRC server. we could use the same, why not? Actually, probably I'll remove that line. I don't think it's that necessary, but okay. And then this will be Nick. And this will be the real name. Cool. So now if we go to main.go, everything we need to change is simply move this from here to here. And everything should still work. The cool thing is that now our struct is simpler. And now the thing is that that struct is the context we need to keep in mind every single time we have a method defined on con, right? So the least information we store there, the easier for the person reading the code will be. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to modify is the fact that we create the connection to the server inside of this package. Why do I want to do that? Well, there's no point on doing that. What if you wanted to use a connection to something else? What if instead of TCP, you were using some other thing like UDP? Why not? Maybe IRC works over UDP. I'm not sure. Maybe. But it is a little bit of out of the place to do this connection in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get all of this code, remove it from here. Actually, we don't need to receive those two parameters anymore here either. And then I'm going to move it to this part. So I'm going to say, let's call it netcon, because con is already defined as a global variable, and I don't want to mess up with it. If this fails, we're going to log fatal. These are the two that we're going to be passing here. Same for this. And it's going to be netcon. Okay, this doesn't want to compile because net.dial is not defined. Interesting. Why wouldn't it be defined? It is net. That's Go imports being weird. I'm sure I have something more serious than that. Okay, debug println, so log println. And here, oh, that's why Go imports didn't work. Cool, log fatal f. Okay, and the thing why I'm doing this is because now I'm going to pass that connection to irc.new. So here we're going to do net.con. And we're going to keep that one in the struct. Cool. So this is a little bit better. It is not much better, but you'll see why I'm doing this in a minute. Okay, so now that we have this, there's a thing that we say often in the Go community, which is you should accept the smallest interface you can when you receive a parameter and return a concrete type when you're returning a value. And in this case, we are already receiving an interface connection. And if you check the documentation for netcon, it is an interface, but it's an interface that has a lot of methods. So let's actually see what functions we're calling. So if we go here and we do con dot, so c.con actually, we're gonna see that we write, we close it, and also we read from it. And that's it. And actually, I'd say that we should not close it. That should be responsibility of the side that creates it. So we're gonna put it as a defer statement here. So, okay, so then we read and we write. So instead of using a connection, we can use a read writer. And now we're gonna use the same here. Read writer, not read write closer, read writer. And this still compiles, but now our code is much better. Why is it better? Because what if I want to test this code? Well, turns out that before I had to create a connection, or at least a mock for a connection, which is actually not that easy. But with this, I can simply use something like a buffer of bytes. It is that simple. And actually we could write some tests. I might do it, I might not. I don't think I will do it, but I will leave it as an exercise to the watcher. So imagine how you write a unit test for this. It's actually quite simple. Okay, one last thing I want to change is I am not convinced that the name for this struct is correct. Con implies connection, and I feel like this is more of a client. The difference is subtle, but very often when you're creating something that receives a connection, is not also a connection. It is something that uses that connection to provide functionality over it, and that is a client. So let's rename it and let's call it client instead. So cool. Okay, so now we have all of this code changed. So now connection is actually called client. So we create a client with new, and then we can call connect, join, etc. Cool. Okay, so what's next? Our package starts to look a little bit better, but there's still a couple of things that I don't like. One of them is the fact that connect returns an error, but join, join exclusive, and all the others do not return any error. And that seems weird to me because you're sending things over the network. So something could fail. So what are you doing with that error? Okay, so when we call send, that write returns an error, but that error is not being taken into account. So let's change that. So let's grab that error and return it later. So now this should do error, return. Oh, that is ugly. Used of closed network connection. Okay, we'll check that later, but that feels very wrong. That feels like there might be some kind of data race going on. Okay, what else? This will not fatal, because we don't need to fatal. We can simply return an error. Okay, we can log it there. So if we receive a message and that it is not something we can parse, we don't need to stop reading, but we can just log it. That seems okay. Okay, so whenever we're doing any of those, so client dot connect, that returns an error, quit if error is not nil, we're just going to print could not. I'm gonna call it with capital C. Normally I do lowercase all the time, but since everything in here is uppercase, I will just follow the same convention. So could not exit gracefully, and it's going to print the error. What else? Here, if that fails, log fatal, could not join channel, and same here. Let's make it actually like this. Log fatal F, sorry. Could not send hello. Why is this? Oh, because that is not a new variable. Okay, we'll see in a minute client.listen, because this is actually a pretty interesting part. But other than that, for now we're gonna ignore it. And other than that, we do client.private message. So if we cannot send that message, we're just going to log it. Could not send message, and this is the reason. And probably continue, because we're not able to do it, so we continue with the next one. Okay, so now that our code compiles and handles more errors, what I want to do next is I want to improve the way we do concurrency. So right now, the way we use concurrency is we call we call go listen, right? And these will exit whenever the channel is closed. So channel is closed when we call quit, and which is done right here. And now quit also returns only when listen has finished. And that is okay, but I feel like it might be easier if rather than doing it that way, quit sends a message to listen, and listen is the one that stops at some point. So rather than waiting for quit that requires this extra wait group, we're gonna wait for listen. So I'm going to remove this wait group because we're not gonna use it anymore. So let's remove it. Let's remove it completely from here too. And now what we're gonna do is our listen is going to be the one that is done at the end. And all of this handling of messages is gonna be done in a different routine. So I'm going to move all of this code to a different routine, handle messages, and this is gonna receive messages, which is a channel of IRC dot private message apparently. Now this will not return any error. So let's see. Oh, because those are local. Wait, let me see. Karma func is defined up here for some reason, but it's only used in there. So I'm gonna move it down here where we actually use it. And that makes everything compile almost. We need that. Okay, so that now compiles. This code is not very good, but it's fine. We don't care about that one. What we're gonna do is, so handle messages of that channel, and then we call listen. And we check for the error there. There you go. We could also do it like this. Cool. So now we, by making the way we use concurrency a little bit different, we made it so whenever we call quit, our listen will stop. So that's how we wait for things to completely stop rather than using that extra wait group. But there's a little bit of a problem here, which is if we call quit, we're closing a channel, and that channel could be closed more than once. So that's not something that I want to do. I could check if the channel is closed, and if it's closed, I don't close it. But that is still a data race, because in between I check if it's closed and I close it, the channel could be closed by someone else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use sync.once. So what is sync.once? Sync.once, we're gonna use it, let's use it here. Sync.once, it's a once. And this once, what it allows you to do is to execute a function just once. No matter how many times you call it, it will be executed only once, and then all the subsequent calls are simply ignored. So let's do that. So what is the part that we want to do only once? Well, we want to do once do close c.close. So now by doing that, we now call that closed channel only once. So we can call it as many times as we want. There will be no panics, which is pretty nice. Okay, one more thing that I want to change is that closed channel should be called quit. We call it always quit. So actually, let me try to use go rename. Say rename this to quit. Let's see if we're lucky enough. There you go, it worked. Okay, so now that changed everything everywhere. Cool, so now we know that we can call connect, then we call listen, and listen will exit only if something bad happens or quit is called. It's kind of like the HTTP server. Listen and serve will exit only if something goes wrong or if a shutdown is called. So pretty similar. Still on the topic of making this API harder to misuse, we can think about what happens with this messages channel and private messages. These are exported. Anyone can see them, right? And who is telling the user that they should be reading from these channels rather than, say, send stuff or even closing those channels? What would happen if the user called close messages? That would be a drama because we would try to send something into a closed channel and that will panic. So how do we limit what people can do with our channels? Well, there's a way of doing that, which is saying, well, this is a channel that you can only read from. But if we do that, our code will not compile because we're sending stuff into it. So what we're going to do is actually, we're going to keep those as non-exported, and we're going to define messages that returns a read-only channel of pointers to messages, which is actually simply messages. And the same idea for private messages, private messages, private messages. And then from here we can do, when we call, let me see, when I save, that should not compile. Go install. Okay, the line 34, actually let me go 34 here, there should be messages, there should be private messages. And then here at the bottom should be private messages and should be messages. Okay, what else? On main.go 124. That will now be a function call to get the messages, and we will receive an read-only messages, and we'll be actually iterating over that. If you're interested on the topic of how to indicate what you can do with a channel in an API, there's a very good talk by Alan Schrift. I have a link here on the show, on the top of the screen, so you can watch it. I definitely recommend it. It's a very good talk. Okay, one little change, and then we go for the last one. The little change that I'm going to do is, very often we're doing send and creating a string in there. And I feel like it'd be better to simply do send with format, which is a string, and arguments, which is a variadic parameter of empty strings. And the cool thing is that then we can do this. So line plus that and pass the arguments. That should be equivalent, except that line is not correct. That is actually format. So that is pretty much equivalent. So these will still work, but now we can do something like this. So nick and real name. And we're gonna have person S here, person S here, person S here, nick. So I like these a little bit better. And also all of these fun.sprintf, we can remove them now because we're just simply passing those parameters internally. Makes it a little bit better, in my opinion. Let's see. C.send, response. One more. C.send, pong. Sure. That is not that important, but whatever. And C.send, we're going up. Cool. That is a pretty small change, but you know, makes it a little bit nicer to use. I will also move this function to the end because we don't really need it to understand the rest of the package. So I'd rather have this in this order. Okay, one last thing that I want to change is this debug. I really do not like package variables that are exported, because then who is in charge of changing it, or who can change it? Well, anyone and at any point, which causes data races. So I'd rather have this as a variable inside of the client. And then I'm going to initialize it right here. So what I'm going to do is logger is going to be that, and logger is logger. And actually you could say that logger is a parameter. Logger. So if the logger that we receive is nil, then we use the default one. And this is okay, well, except for the little detail that it does not compile, but we can fix that quite easily, saying that that should be now c.logger.println. There you go. Does that compile? Let's check real quick. Go install. It does not compile because main.go uses something different. Okay, so main.go 61 what we're doing here is kind of a weird thing. I'm not really sure I like it, but we're creating a new. So we decide what is the output, and then we set it. And that is, yeah, I don't like it. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm gonna start with a logger, which by default is gonna be log.new of ostd out with the same things that we had here. Let's say, where did it go? In main, sorry, here. So those are the things we're gonna use. That is our default, why not? And if not debugged, then we're gonna set the logger output to log file. Also, at some point, we should close that file. Yeah, again, don't pay too much attention to this part of the code because it's not that important. But basically, the cool part is that then when I call new, now I could do logger. And this should now compile. Let's see. Cool. So this compiles again. And this is okay, but what if next I say, well, sure, but in send here, we sleep for a second, and I want that to be c.sleep or c.pause. Let's call it pause. So now we have one more variable here, which is pause of type duration. And then I want to pass it here, pause time duration. So here then I pass 1 second. And this starts to be quite annoying really fast because we keep on adding more and more parameters here. So rather than doing this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define options. It's what we call functional options, and they're really cool. So the way this is going to work is rather than having this, we're simply going to use the default directly there in our logger. That's going to be our client, and we're going to return that client. And we're going to have a bunch of options. And that is a bunch of options. And what is an option? We're going to define an option as something that you execute on a client and does not return anything. So now it seems a little bit weird, but if we define with logger as a function that given logger log.logger returns an option, this will be returns a function that given a client and the logger sets the logger to be logger. And we can also define with pause time dot duration returns an option, return func client c.pause equals pause. Okay, and now the cool thing is that then we can say, well, the default pause is going to be 1 second. But if we want to change it, we can do it quite simply by coming here and saying IRC with pause of 500 milliseconds, for instance. And we can also say IRC with logger. Ooh, I almost forgot. We need to iterate over all the options, of course, and call option on the client. Otherwise, we're not applying any of those options. So that is important. I almost forgot. Do not forget that thing. Okay, this is a very nice pattern to allow your package to receive a bunch of different options, but only the ones that the user wants to use are the ones that we need to write by using variadic arguments over a type options, which is actually a function that modifies our options. And this might seem like it's dangerous, but it is not, because only a function, an option defined inside of this package will have access to the non-exported types of client. So it is not a problem at all. Someone else could create new options if they want to, but they will need to just use the ones that are exported, which is none of them. So we don't have any risk on that side. And finally, to make sure that this is actually an API that I like, something that I do pretty often, and especially now because this is the moment where I would definitely add a lot of documentation. Now what I will do is run go doc locally. If you've never done that, it's actually very useful because it allows you to see the documentation for all the packages in your Go path. So now I can go to packages and find shellbot and find IRC and see that these are all the things that we're exporting. So we have private messages and quit, all of these things. That looks pretty good. We have the options, we have the private message, and that seems pretty good. Of course, we're missing all the documentation. That is a fact, but I feel like now the API is quite simple to use. Great, so let's go real quick through all the changes that we get. We started by removing some unused code. Then we removed fields that were not really necessary from the connection. Remember those fields that were in the struct just because we were using them in the wrong function. We were passing them as parameters in new, but using them only in connect. So we moved them and removed the necessity of having it in the struct. Then that opened the door to start moving parameters around and adding one more parameter. And rather than receiving the server and port, we started receiving a connection. Right after that connection made sense to, rather than having an actual connection with all the methods, we moved to simply a read writer, which allows us to write code much easier, but also to use this code for anything else. If you wanted to do something like, I don't know, an IRC chat over Unix sockets, you could do it now, which is pretty nice. Then we started changing a little bit more subtle things, like play with concurrency and decide that rather than making quit be the one that allows us to wait until everything has been released, we just use quit as a way to signal that listen should stop. Basically copying the way the HTTP listen and serve works with shutdown. And then finally, to make our API a little bit better, we removed the debug global variable and instead we started using options. And then we made our two channels messages and private messages private, so non-exported, and we exported them with methods in the struct that returns the channel as a read-only channel, therefore making sure that no one else could either write or close those channels. And with all of that, I think that the API, even though the code itself didn't change that much, the API is much easier to use and, as I said at the beginning, way harder to misuse, which in my opinion are the properties of a good API. So this is the end of the episode. I am working on the next episode already. It will be on gRPC and Go because there's a lot of people asking me to do that. If you have other topics that you would like me to cover, let me know. Send me a message on Twitter or simply leave a comment down here. And as always, subscribe and thanks for watching.